Quick side note, this case is very brutal and I might be adding images which some may find disturbing. I am so tired, it's not even funny. I'm running on 2 hours of sleep, so God knows what you're going to get out of this video. Hey, it's Mel, I hope you're doing well and welcome back to my channel. If you're new, it's lovely to have you here. Today we're going to be looking at the 1929 unsolved case of the Valentine's Day Massacre. This case occurred in Chicago. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. This was a gang shooting which occurred on the 14th of February 1929 in Chicago. A well-known local gangster, Frank Gusenberg, was rushed to hospital with 14 gunshot wounds. When the police asked Frank, "Who shot you?" he replied, quote, "No one shot me," end quote. He most likely remained silent because he was scared of his killer. 3 hours later, Frank died. He was the final victim of what became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre, the most infamous mob hit in history. Frank and 6 other members of Georgia Bugs Moran's Northside gang had been lined up against a wall in his garage and slaughtered in a hail of gunfire. Many people believed that Al Capone was behind the hit, which might explain Frank's reluctance to say a word to the police. But to this day, the killers of the Valentine's Day Massacre have never been caught or identified. On the 14th of February around 10:30 a.m, 4 armed men approached Moran's warehouse at 2122 North Clark Street. 2 of them were dressed as police officers, while the other 2 just looked like well-dressed civilians. The driver wore an expensive chinchilla and a fedora hat. They were there on business, but not the kind of business that usually unfolds in broad daylight. The 6 men inside the warehouse were affiliated with gang leader Moran. They all answered to him. One of them, called Reinhard Schwimmer, wasn't really a gang member. He was an optometrist, but he liked having bad friends around, criminals. The rest of them were a mixture of killers, embezzlers and robbers, but all with a German shepherd named Highball. Like I said before, all the men answered to Moran and they didn't expect anything out of the ordinary that morning. No one knows exactly what happened inside the warehouse. The 4 armed men had been waiting for a signal when nightclub owner Albert Weinshank, who they may have mistaken for Moran himself, entered the building. The 4 men got the signal to move in. They used Tommy guns and a 12-gauge shotgun. The victims were all facing the wall. The dog Highball was spared and later found by police tied to a car bumper nearby. The 6 victims were Adam Hayer, Albert Kachelik, Weinshank Swimmer, John May and Peter Gusenberg. As previously mentioned, Peter's brother Frank died 3 hours later after the incident. Moran himself never made it into the warehouse that morning. There were no witnesses to the shooting and the attack ended as quickly as it started. After the incident, the 4 men left the warehouse and vanished. The investigation into the massacre focused primarily on rival Chicago mobster Al Capone, even though he had a solid alibi. He was in a Florida courthouse at the time of the killings, but he had a widespread and a lot of power. He also had a well-known vendetta against Moran. The shooting looked like it was in Capone's style. For years, Moran and Capone ran opposing gangs in Chicago. Moran's men were Irish Northsiders, and Capone's were Italian Southsiders. The 2 men often clashed over control of the city in the 1920s, especially when it came to bootlegging booze during Prohibition. In September 1926, Moran and his men made the conflict worse when one day they drove past a hotel where Capone and his men were eating and shot at the building with more than 1,000 bullets. Somehow, Capone escaped unharmed. At the time of the massacre, Capone was 30 years old. Upon hearing that Moran had put a £50,000 bounty on his head, Capone allegedly decided he'd had enough and he was going to make the first strike. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Moran had been working on producing a shipment of stolen Canadian whiskey, an enterprise in which Capone was also heavily invested. Moran ran his illegal operation out of the SMC Cartridge Co. garage on Clark Street, the site of the shooting. On the morning of 14th of February, Capone's men would have known where to find Moran's men, and they also had motive to kill. But it's likely that Moran was the ultimate target. Moran was at the scene, but he arrived late. He never actually made it into the warehouse. Once he saw police cars outside of his building, he turned around and walked the other way. He got a coffee and ran into one of his associates, who he then told to avoid the garage because it looked like the police were raiding it. But Moran had no idea that his men were killed inside the warehouse. After the massacre, Moran's reputation as being one of the top gangsters of Chicago was ruined. There was still a question of who was behind the massacre. There are a few suspects. Fred Burke, a known associate of Capone's, got in a car crash and killed a police officer on the 14th of December, the same year of the shooting. He escaped, but police found guns in his home that were used in the massacre. Fred was arrested in 1931, but didn't give out any names. Another man, alleged low-level gangster that was associated with Capone, later claimed that Capone had planned the hit in October or November of 1928. The man's name was Brian Bolton. He said that he had acted as a lookout on the morning of the massacre. His job was to give a signal once Moran arrived. Brian thought he saw Moran, so he gave the signal. It's likely that he mistook nightclub owner Albert Weinshank, one of the victims, for the gang leader. Little is known about Albert. Moran had no doubts at all as to who was responsible for the massacre. Of course it could be Capone. Who else? But was it? Moran and his men had more than one enemy, of course. Two of the shooters wore police uniforms, leading some to believe that they were the police. When Sergeant Thomas J. Loftus arrived at the scene, he found Frank Gusenberg alive around the carnage. Frank said, quote, "Cops did it," end quote. There were so many motives for this crime. Apparently Moran and his men had stolen bootleg liquor from a crooked cop. The question is, could this be retaliation? Honestly, no. I mean, that's a bit brutal. You don't kill a bunch of people just because they stole your alcohol. Well, it depends how much. I don't know. If so, why had the attackers left money? Each victim had thousands of dollars in their pockets, that's my question. Who walks around with that much money in their pocket? Is that physically possible? One theory involved the Purple Gang, a gang based in Detroit with whom Capone had ties to. Some suspected that Moran himself ordered the hit, maybe because he'd grown irritated with the Gusenberg brothers. Other people thought that the brothers may have been the targets because they'd killed a young firefighter and his family wanted revenge. Syphilis left Capone with the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child in his final years. He died at age 48 in 1947 due to cardiac arrest. A lot of pressure was put on the police to lower gang activity in Chicago. Capone was never charged in connection to the massacre. Before his death, he'd never said anything about the massacre. The building where the crime took place was demolished in the 1960s, but bricks from the building bearing bullet holes were sold off, and most of them are now kept in the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. The case remains unsolved, even though many people believe that Capone was the culprit. That's all for today. That was the brutal unsolved case of the Valentine's Day Massacre. Like the video and leave a comment below. What are your thoughts on this case? As always, thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.